In a setting built on lies, a corpse god worshipped as living, a legion of traitors who may be loyal, a history edited by the people who wrote it, there is one deception that sits above all the others, and the Imperium never even knew it was being told. The King in Yellow, a name that has drifted at the edges of the lore, attached to the Dark King, to the encroaching ruin, to the prophecies of the end. For most of the setting's history, it wasn't a character at all. It was a shape in the negative space, a pattern in things that seemed unrelated, a hand you could only see by the things it moved. And that is exactly what the greatest deception looks like. Not a villain who announces himself. A force that hides inside the story you already believe, that lets you think the Emperor's slow death is natural, that the ruin is inevitable, that the end is just entropy, while all along steering every one of those things toward a single outcome it authored before the Imperium was born. The chaos gods deceive, Tzeentch schemes, but they want to be feared. The King in Yellow's masterstroke was to make the galaxy believe he didn't exist at all. And the day the mask slips is the day the Imperium realizes its fall was never an accident. It was a performance, and it was always wearing yellow. To understand why that claim carries weight, you need to first understand what the setting already treats as ordinary. Warhammer 40,000 was built, from the ground up, on institutionalized deception, a setting so saturated with lies that any single one of them risks sounding mundane by comparison. The Emperor declared the imperial truth across every world the Great Crusade conquered, an atheistic, rationalist ideology that denied the existence of gods and the supernatural. He told his legions there were no demons. He suppressed his librarians. He burned the holy city Monarchia to ash when Lorgar's word-bearers built a religion in his name. The entire intellectual architecture of the early Imperium rested on a single principle. There is no supernatural, only the rational and the real. And he knew it was false. He had walked into the warp at Molech, bargained with the ruinous powers under the name Neoth, and emerged carrying the seed of apotheosis, the potential for a god birth that hadn't happened yet. He kept that knowledge from his sons, his generals, humanity itself. He suppressed faith not because religion was philosophically wrong, but because a humanity that believed in gods might believe in the right ones, and the Emperor couldn't afford scrutiny of what was growing inside him. The foundational lie of the 41st millennium wasn't Horus's betrayal. Horus's betrayal was made possible by the imperial truth's silence. Erebus, first chaplain of the word-bearers, understood the structural weakness that silence created. He engineered Horus's corruption at Davin, masterminded the Istvan III betrayal, systematically eliminated the loyalist elements inside the traitor legions before they could warn anyone. Decades of published lore call him the father of the Horus heresy, the single figure most directly responsible for the worst civil war in human history. But Erebus is known. His role is documented, his methods catalogued. Tzeentch schemes across timescales that span millennia, weaving what the Lexicanum describes as plans that bind the galaxy in the weave of his complex schemes just as a spider binds a fly. His deceptions are legendary, plots so layered that even their apparent outcomes are misdirection. He is the patron deity of manipulation in a setting already saturated with it. And yet, Tzeentch is named, he is feared, he is counted, given a domain in the warp, depicted with demons that wear his colors. When Tzeentch moves, the motion is eventually legible. He wants to be the architect of schemes, and in his own way, wants that known. The king in Yellow's first deception wasn't the fall of the Imperium. It was simpler and more complete, convincing the galaxy he didn't exist at all. The name is borrowed from a 129-year-old horror story. In 1895, American writer Robert W. Chambers published a short story collection called The King in Yellow. The book centered on a forbidden play, a text that induced madness in its readers, and on a mysterious entity the play was named for. The entity never appears directly. Its power is specifically the power of incomplete revelation. You see enough to understand the shape of the thing, never enough to name it fully. The horror lives in the incompleteness. When Dan Abnett borrowed that name for a Warhammer 40,000 character, the wargamer notes explicitly that readers familiar with Chambers' work will recognize the reference. The King in Yellow fan wiki lists Abnett's Warhammer novels among the fiction drawing on the 1895 source. Abnett transplanted the concept intact, a hidden power operating through the negative space of what people think they know. This channel presents what follows as its reading of a pattern in published material, a forensic argument based on what Abnett has written across 2 decades, not a decree from Nottingham. Much of the King in Yellow's ultimate nature and role in the end times remains unconfirmed by GW. Flag planted. Now, the pattern. The 40K King in Yellow first appears by name in Pariah, published by Black Library in 2012, the opening novel of Abnett's Beguin trilogy. This is Black Library canon, officially published by Games Workshop, but the King in Yellow does not appear in any codex, rulebook, or White Dwarf. He exists in Abnett's fiction, and nowhere else in GW's publications. That distinction matters for everything that follows. What the Beguin novels establish, across Pariah and the 2021 sequel, Penitent, is a figure who has spent millennia building a hidden army opposed to the Imperium, operating from a location outside both real space and the warp, strongly implied in available analyses to be within the Eldari webway. His forces include psychically inert blanks, artificial warp entities, and an army built specifically to evade standard psychic detection. His documented goal across both novels is to obtain the Emperor's true name, a metaphysical key that would, in the setting's warp logic, grant power over the Emperor himself. He has been running this operation invisibly for the full span of the Imperium. Penitent ends with a hexagrammatic cipher that, in-universe, appears to identify the King in Yellow as Constantine Valdor, the former Captain General of the Legio Custodes, who disappeared from Imperial records shortly after the heresy, and who would, at the Beguin trilogy's point in time, be over 11,000 years old. This identification is contested. It's presented as intelligence within a spy novel, and spy novels deal in unreliable intelligence. GW hasn't confirmed it out of universe. The point for this argument isn't who the King in Yellow is. The point is what he has been doing. Now set that character against the canonical GW term, encroaching ruin. Encroaching ruin is one of 8 etheric dominions of chaos, metaphysical aspects of the warp that exist in the spaces between the 4 main chaos gods, defined in GW's The Burning of Om Mat Horus Heresy event scenario. The text reads, "Chaos in its purest form is a terror that few can stand before and remain sane. It hungers only for destruction, that all things mortal meet their end and be forgotten. Not Khorne's warfare, not Nurgle's plague, not Tzeentch's mutation. The erasure of everything that exists, without preference or purpose, as a cosmic constant. The Lexicanum describes the Dark King as a canonical potential fifth chaos god, its nature aligned with the encroaching ruin, the domain that hungers only for destruction, that all things mortal meet their end and be forgotten.
No GW text canonically links the King in Yellow of the Beguin novels to the encroaching ruin domain. That connection is fan synthesis, and this channel presents it as such. But both descriptions exist in canon. Both describe the same orientation toward total erasure, and both, across Abnett's fiction and the end times material, converge on the same terminal event, the Emperor's death, and what it means for everything that comes after. Aaron Dembski Bowden published Master of Mankind in December 2016, the 41st novel in the Horus Heresy series. Its emotional centerpiece is a prophetic vision experienced by Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels. The vision shows him the Emperor, not Horus, not a daemon, the Emperor of mankind, seated on a black, ruinous throne, ruling as a tyrannical warp god. This is the future the Emperor has become, a chaos god of absolute ruin, the destroyer of everything he spent 10,000 years building. The horror of Sanguinius's vision isn't that chaos wins, it's that the Emperor wins as a chaos god. The ruinous powers didn't need to kill the Emperor. They needed him to save humanity by becoming humanity's worst possible ruler. The mechanism is the Molech bargain. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor entered the warp and emerged carrying what multiple accounts describe as a fragment of the Dark King's power, a portion of a god that had not yet been born. In the warp's non-linear relationship with time, the Dark King already exists in some form, even though its emergence in real space hasn't occurred. The Emperor carrying that fragment means the thing on the Golden Throne has held, for 10 millennia, the unborn potential of the galaxy's final ruin. At the Siege of Terra, the Emperor drew on it. When it became apparent that conventional power couldn't defeat Horus, the Emperor reached into the warp without restriction. The Lexicanum, sourcing directly from The End and the Death Volume 2, describes what happened. Taking the form of a lightning-sheathed sphere of obsidian, the Emperor's power was such that he even unintentionally slew all of the custodians around him, turning them into little more than heavily burnt walking corpses. Demons fled before him. Traitors scattered. He had become the Dark King, or was becoming it. Malcador, sensing his old friend from afar, was distressed, believing he had gone too far. What stopped the transformation was Olanius Person, a mortal man standing before an emperor on the threshold of becoming something irreversible. Person reminded the emperor of his humanity. The emperor, confronted by a mortal's presence at that precise threshold, chose to shed the power. He walked into his battle with Horus as a diminished being, gambling humanity's future on faith rather than force. Horus killed him, smashed the Emperor's skull with Worldbreaker, and the Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, where he has been dying at an accelerating, metered rate ever since. The Golden Throne is failing. This is confirmed across multiple GW publications. The throne's mechanisms have developed failures beyond the Adeptus Mechanicus's ability to repair. Canon also establishes that the throne now requires approximately 10 times the number of psychers to sustain the Emperor's presence as it did immediately after the siege. The black ships scour the galaxy. 1,000 souls a day, every day, for 10,000 years. The rate of demand is still rising. To the 41st millennium Imperium, this looks like entropy, ancient technology failing under an impossible load. Of course, it's getting worse. Everything in this setting gets worse eventually.
Then read what a chaos entity states in The End and the Death, Volume 2. The passage attested across multiple reader citations from Abnett's November 2023 novel. I will be born from the Emperor's death as he dies. He becomes the Dark King. This is the same thing. The Emperor's death and the Dark King's birth aren't cause and effect. They are the same event, described from two angles. The seed carried from Molech has been waiting inside the dying emperor for 10,000 years. The Golden Throne's failure isn't a mechanical problem. In this reading, it's a countdown. The lexicanum is explicit about what the ruinous powers believe. Time flows differently to chaos, and the Dark King's servants and dominion already exist. The emergence was stalled at the siege by person's intervention, not prevented. The servants already exist. The domain already exists. The only missing component is the Emperor's death, which has been in slow, measurable progress since the moment Rogel Dorn found him broken on the floor of the vengeful spirit. The word Grimdark comes from Warhammer 40,000. The tagline, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war," is the source text from which the entire genre label derives. In a 2021 Warhammer community article, GW describes the Imperium explicitly as a cautionary tale of what could happen should the very worst of humanity's lust for power and extreme unyielding xenophobia set in. The darkness is designed. The hopelessness is the premise, not a dramatic development. This was the design from the first edition of the game. The Golden Throne's failure, the chaos corruption, the internal rot, canonical from the beginning. Academic analysis of 40K as a cultural object consistently identifies a prophesied time of ending as the setting's foundational baseline. The Imperium was always going to fall. That was always the point. And this is the specific geometry of the disguise. In a setting where every institution is in managed decline, where every victory is temporary, where the grim dark premise guarantees that the long defeat continues. Any specific instance of decline is invisible as an authored event. The throne getting worse isn't a plot point in the 41st millennium. It's just the setting being the setting. The chaos incursions aren't anomalies. They're the environment. The attrition of humanity across 1,000 war zones isn't a strategy being executed against them. It's the background noise the franchise runs on. The Cicatrix Maledictum demonstrates this with precision. When the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum in High Gothic, tore real space in half, cutting vast sections of the Imperium off from Terra and the Astronomicon, every faction read it as a chaos event. The culmination of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. The setting got worse. Again. Nobody asked who needed them watching Abaddon. A Horus Heresy community discussion captured the underlying mechanism. When Horus was shown a vision of the 41st millennium's endless war, he fought to prevent it. That resistance is precisely what instantiated it. The mechanism of prophecy in this setting is specifically that seeing the future and trying to change it makes the future unchangeable. The fatalism is structural. The characters believe it, act on it, and therefore instantiate it. A setting designed around that mechanism is a setting where hiding an authored process inside the background noise isn't just possible. It's the only disguise that could ever have worked completely. Screaming demons are visible. Galaxy-spanning entropy is invisible. And a patient force that has been operating for 10,000 years doesn't need to scream. It needs the catastrophe to look exactly like everyone expected catastrophe to look. GW built that world deliberately.
They built a universe so completely saturated with natural-looking decay that an authored collapse would be indistinguishable from the noise they designed.
The setting's own creators built the disguise, and whatever has been operating inside that disguise has had 10,000 years to use it. Dan Abnett wrote all 3 volumes of The End and the Death, published in February 2023, November 2023, and January 2024, concluding the 65-novel Horus Heresy series that ran from 2006 to 2024. He also wrote Pariah in 2012 and Penitent in 2021, the novels that introduced and developed the King in Yellow as a character. One author, 2 narrative threads, more than 2 decades of published material, both converging on the same terminal event. What Abnett built into the heresy's conclusion wasn't resolution. It was confirmation that the active engine of everything after the siege was still running. One Lexicanum-sourced canonical detail, drawn directly from The End and the Death. Before the siege began, Harlequins visited Ulthwé to perform the Dance of the End and the Death, a ritual enactment of the siege itself, staged in advance. In the dance, Slaanesh was replaced with a new god. A blue-hooded solitaire portrayed this entity. The Harlequins named it the Dark King. The Eldari, who interact with time non-linearly through their relationship with the eternal warp present, already knew the outcome. They performed the ending before the ending happened. The Dark King wasn't the siege's dramatic resolution. The Emperor survived, in the narrow sense of killing Horus before expiring. But in the Harlequins' cosmological accounting, the siege ended with the Dark King, because the siege put the Emperor on the throne. And the throne is what makes the Dark King's eventual emergence not just possible, but gravitationally inevitable. The Dark King had already spoken before The End and the Death was published. A White Dwarf short story titled Visions of Darkness, later incorporated into the Lexicanum's Dark King entry, records the entity addressing Malcador the Sigillite during an Imperial tarot reading. The description from that canonical account: a shadowy figure with a flaming crown and a bladed claw of flame, seated on a dark throne aboard the Vengeful Spirit, overlooking a burning world, rising as Malcador appears before him. The Dark King tells him, "I see you, little slave. I see you reaching into the future in search of hope. Look at me, and know that I am here. I am existence. See me, and know that I am the future, and the only hope that you will find." This was published 4 years before The End and the Death, Volume 1. The Dark King was already announcing itself in canonical GW material, in White Dwarf, not Black Library fiction, while the novels that would name it openly were still years away. The servants already existed. The domain was already named in game material. The vision was already in print. The mask was always thin. Most people weren't looking at it. Fans who had read both the Beguin novels and The End and the Death identified the convergence immediately after the trilogy's conclusion. Community discussion noted what one analysis described as Abnett harking back to his own past lore, the Inquisitor-era fiction, the King of Chaos operating in the margins. Whether Abnett built this as a single unified narrative across 22 years of published work, or whether it's the natural emergence of one author's thematic obsessions surfacing across 2 connected bodies of fiction, GW hasn't said. Abnett hasn't said. What GW has confirmed: the Dark King's emergence was stalled, not prevented. Its servants already exist in the warp. Its domain, encroaching ruin, is canonical. And the only event required to complete the equation has been in slow, measured, accelerating progress since the moment Horus Lupercal smashed the skull of the most powerful psychic in the galaxy and left him for dead. The pattern was always there. It only required the end of an 18-year novel series to make it fully legible. Here is what the assembled picture looks like.
The 41st Millennium Imperium is the most comprehensively broken political civilization in all of science fiction. A trillion-strong empire consuming 1,000 lives a day to keep its psychic infrastructure running, losing ground on 100 fronts simultaneously, governed by institutions that actively suppress the knowledge required to govern effectively. GW's own words, a cautionary tale. The long defeat, entropy at civilizational scale. Every instinct in this setting tells you to read that as the natural state, history bending toward darkness, as it always was going to. The Imperium was built on a foundational lie. It fought a civil war it couldn't survive intact, and now it's dying at whatever pace dying things die. But the Horus heresy was engineered. The imperial truth's silence created the structural weakness Erebus exploited at Davin. The corruption was planted by deliberate design. The foundational catastrophe of the 41st millennium was an authored event masquerading as tragedy. And the Emperor carried out of the warp a piece of something that hadn't been born yet. A potential fifth chaos god whose servants already exist, whose domain is named and canonical, whose birth requires only one event, and whose timeline for that event is the Golden Throne's remaining operational lifespan. In that context, 10,000 years of the throne's degradation reads differently. Not erratic, not random, but directional, steady, pointed at a specific outcome with the quiet consistency of a process rather than the noise of a system under organic strain. The Emperor gets weaker, the wards get thinner. The conditions for what the encroaching ruin names as the destruction of all things mortal draw incrementally closer. This is the argument this channel makes, clearly flagged as argument. The King in Yellow of Abnett's Beguin fiction and the Dark King of the End Times material may be threads of the same pattern, a force operating for the full lifespan of the Imperium in the negative space, using the setting's designed fatalism as its cover, hiding an authored collapse inside the backdrop of a story everyone believed was simply told by entropy. The deception is that the audience and the characters, and perhaps GW's own readers for decades, interpreted the decline as inevitable when the lore was building the case for authored intent the entire time. A setting built on the premise that there is only war, that only the most naive expect rescue or resolution, is a setting that has already decided not to look for the hand causing the fall. That decision was the weapon, and it was wearing yellow the whole time. Warhammer 40,000 taught you to fear the enemies that announce themselves. The screaming demon, the scheming god, the traitor with a banner. And while you watched them, something else worked in the quiet, in the negative space, in the things you assumed were just the way the story goes. The King in Yellow didn't need a legion or a war band or a throne of skulls. It needed you to believe the Imperium's fall was natural, that the Emperor was simply dying, that the ruin was simply coming, that the end was simply fate. That belief was the deception. And the day the mask finally slips, the galaxy will understand the most terrible thing of all. Its doom was never an accident. It was authored, it was patient, and it was always, always wearing yellow. Subscribe for more end times lore and deep dives into the 40K canon.